everybody! Welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we are studying Alma, chapters 30 and 31. Yes, only 2 chapters this week, which we have had some pretty hefty reading assignments the past few weeks, so this is kind of nice. But these 2 chapters are not 2 little chapters. I mean, lengthwise, they're pretty average, actually, but in them, we have 2 totally different stories, but I'm really excited that they're paired together because even though they are very distinct separate stories in both chapters 30 and 31, they have a very, very strong thread of connection, and that is we're going to learn about 2 different ways that people turned against Christ, away from Christ. Now, we sometimes call this anti-Christ, but it's anything that is turning people away from Christ, and we're going to learn 2 different ideologies as we go into the 2 stories this week. Now, chapter 30 is all about someone named Korihor. We're going to learn his whole story. Chapter 31, we're going to focus on the Zoramites, and their story actually continues on next week, and unfortunately for a lot longer in the future as well. But we get the origin story for the Zoramites and all their ideologies. So just as we go through the reading, look for what are these reasonings that these people are coming up with that are keeping them away from Christ, that are turning them away from Christ. I think it's really interesting to kind of point those out. In the 16th year of the reign of the judges, just to kind of keep track of the timeline here, that is when the Great War ended that we just talked about. Now, if you're like, wait, what war are we talking about? We know the sons of Mosiah had their very successful mission to the Lamanites, right? And they had this big group called the Anti-Nephi-Lehi's, now called the Ammonites. And the Ammonites are now safely in the Nephite land. But the Lamanites didn't like that, to the ones who hadn't been converted, so they came to battle against the Ammonites. But what had the Ammonites done with all their weapons? They had buried them deep in the ground, and so the Nephites agreed to go to battle in defense of these Ammonites. And I think that's just amazing. But they're like, we're going to do it. The battle was brutal. Absolutely brutal. And we talked about some of the effects of that at the end of last week, that this was a huge battle, a lot of losses on both sides. The Nephites were eventually victorious and they drove the Lamanites out of the land. The Ammonites are still there in the land of Jershon, but there's a lot of rough stuff that is still going on that these Nephites are having to deal with. So that is in the 16th year of the reign of the judges. And we know that Korihor's story that we start in chapter 30 is the 17th year of the reign of the judges, which, if you're keeping track, is around 75 BC. Just kind of interesting to keep that all in perspective of where we're at. Okay, let's dive into chapter 30, which starts with Korihor's story. So there is a man named Korihor, and it says he comes into the land. And he comes first to Zarahemla. Now, by Zarahemla, I mean the city of Zarahemla. Remember that sometimes Zarahemla is used as the general name for all of the Nephite lands, even though there's tons of cities within that. But there's also a capital city called Zarahemla. So Korihor comes here, and Korihor has a message for everyone. And that message is, Christ is not coming. He's not real. Surprise, news alert, everyone, right? So he's spreading this news throughout Zarahemla, and he's actually having quite a bit of success. He's convincing a lot of people. And so with this success, he starts to go to other cities. And in some cities, he continues to have other success. And then in other cities, he is completely rejected and doesn't have any success, which includes the land of Jershon, where all the Ammonites are. The Ammonites are like, we are not denying this. We literally just put our lives at risk for this. So no thank you, Korihor. So Korihor had no success with the Ammonites, but he is having successes here and there. Eventually he is brought back to that capital city of Zarahemla in front of Alma. Remember, Alma is serving as the high priest, basically the prophet of the land, the leader of the church. And also he's brought before the chief judge. And the chief judge is the political ruler of the time. I don't think he's named in this chapter, but it's Nephi-Ha. That's who's the chief judge. It's been Nephi-Ha for the past, since 88, so about 8 years now at this point. And Korihor is brought before them. And they're like, what? They're starting to question Korihor. What are you doing? And Korihor completely denies God. He denies Christ. And then he starts to accuse, this part just makes me laugh a little bit. He starts to accuse Alma of preaching only so that he can get really rich and be lazy and let everyone else do work for him. Do you want to read Alma's story? I don't think that lines up with what I know about Alma. And Alma was just like, no, what are you talking about? I imagine that was his reaction. Anyway, so Alma is continuing to have this back and forth with Korihor, and Korihor is just basically spewing out all his ideology, what he thinks. And he gets to the point where Korihor is like, all right, show me a sign. If you are so convinced God is real, show me a sign. And Alma is like, look around you. Look at the earth. Look at the heavens and the stars and the planets. Like, there are signs everywhere that a God created and designed this. And Korihor was like, no, not that sign. I want a better sign. And Alma's like, really? You sure? Okay, you asked for it. And as a sign, Korihor is struck dumb, which means he's not able to speak anymore. It's at this point that Korihor then admits that he knew all along that God really did exist. And he confesses everything, and he then goes from town to town throughout the Nephite lands and is just kind of rejected until he gets to the land where the Zoramites are, and he is trampled to death by the Zoramites. And that is the end of Korihor's story. Now, Zoramites. Who are the Zoramites? Well, we're about to find out in chapter 31, because it's at this point in time that Alma, as the high priest, gets wind that there's a group of Nephites called the Zoramites, and they happen to live like kind of on the border close to where the Lamanites are, and they're doing some weird stuff with religion. They need some correction from Alma. They need a lot of spiritual correction. And so Alma hears about this, and he's like, okay, let me just grab some people to come with me and let's go visit the Zoramites. Now listen to the group that he grabs to go with him on this little trip to the Zoramites. So we've got Alma, the literal prophet. He brings Ammon, Aaron, and one of the other sons of Mosiah. So we've got 3 out of the 4 sons of Mosiah, who just had the most epic missionary stories ever, right? He brings Amulek, who was his mission companion for a long time, starting in the land of Ammonihah, right? Zeezrom, the former wicked lawyer, and it seems like Zeezrom and Amulek have maybe been companions and preaching a little bit. And Alma also brings 2 of his 3 sons. Now, this is the first that we're hearing of Alma's sons, although it will certainly not be the last. We learned that they're very briefly mentioned in this chapter. We know that the oldest is named Helaman, the next is Shiblon, and the youngest is Corianton. We learned that Helaman, the oldest, stayed in Zarahemla, presumably Alma told him to, and the younger 2 Alma brings on this missionary journey. Now, although we aren't focusing on these sons right now, I just want you to keep in perspective what they are supposed to be doing right now, what these 2 younger sons are supposed to be doing on the mission trip, because we'll get back to that in future chapters, but just keep that in mind. Helaman, the one who stays at home, he will eventually become the high priest and take over for his dad, so we'll talk a lot more about Helaman, but that's about all we learn. Okay, so Alma has pretty much assembled the Avengers of missionaries, like literally some of the best people ever, and he's like, let's go to the Zoramites. So they go to the Zoramites, and you can just feel this power, right? And they are shocked. In fact, it's a little humorous to read through the description of Alma's reaction to what he sees. He's like, what is going on here? These Zoramites, the people there, had decided that Christ wasn't coming, but God still exists. And so we have this big synagogue, and we're going to build this giant tower in the middle, and it's called the Rameumptom, and there's only space for 1 person at a time. And so on the day of the week that it is to worship, you, one at a time, go to the top of the tower and you repeat this very public and prideful prayer in front of everyone. And then you come back down and then you go back to your house and you don't have to worry about religion for the rest of the week. And Alma and all the people that came with him are like, what are they doing? Where did this even come from? They are shocked. And in fact, actually, Alma is really sorrowed. He is very upset by what he's seeing. And he talks a little bit about this. And so Alma gathers his missionary Avengers group together, and it says, gives them the Spirit, which we can interpret as he sets them apart or ordains them to something or whatever. He gives them priesthood power, and they decide to then break up and go and preach to the Zoramites. And that's where we end. That's it. That's the end of the story for this week. Obviously, next week we will get the ending of that specific story with the Zoramites, but that's it. Two very different ideologies. One of them with Korihor being so focused on none of this is real. God doesn't exist. Christ isn't coming. What are you wasting your time with? And in fact, my personal focus question for this week is, as I was reading through a lot of what Korihor was saying, and even what the Zoramites are saying too, I was like, I think I've literally read these words word for word on a social media post. Like, they are not ancient old arguments. They are what I'm hearing still right now against religion in general, Christianity in general, or our church specifically. A lot of arguments that I see that are still used today. And so I want to kind of pull out, what are these common arguments that Korihor uses against religion in general, and then the Zoramites are using to kind of pervert the religion, to take religion, in some ways they're making it more convoluted, in other ways they're making it more convenient. It's just like this weird mixture of both. Where am I seeing these arguments, and am I able to call them out when I see them in current times? And am I fortifying myself against those arguments? Do I feel strongly enough in what I believe, and do I understand why those arguments don't hold any water? Especially if you're gonna say that, you know, Alma just wants to make money and be really lazy. I don't know if you've met any of our apostles. I have not met many. I've had the chance to like interact with one or two very briefly. And in those brief interactions, I've learned they're traveling off to a whole different country next weekend to hold a stake conference. And then they're dedicating a temple in a different continent the next weekend. And then they have to work on writing their talk. Like, they are not sitting in their ivory towers, sleeping and looking down at us. These are people who are doing their best and working very hard. Anyways, that's just an example of these arguments that I see and what I know that shores up my testimony. Of course, all focused back on serving Jesus Christ, serving God, knowing that they exist, and what we do when we know that. Okay, have a great week this week with these two very interesting chapters, and happy studying.